Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of the Extreme Exchange. And today I'm joined with my good friends from Primus here, Brendan, Chyi Hann, and Kai. Alright, so let's get right to it. So anyway, the thing in question today is, well, do you need a church to be counted as a Christian, right? Do you need a church to be a Christian? So anyone has any thoughts right off the bat? I guess a yes or no answer first.
So the last time I discussed with the guy who brought up this topic, he said that you technically don't need a church. It's just that it's very hard to get by without a church.
Yeah,
like almost impossible.
Instinctively, I feel it's a no.
That you don't need a church.
Yeah, but then again, I ask again. I said a yes.
Isn't there a verse that says somewhere that you should be in a community to sound?
Yeah.
Verse? See.
Is it the iron? No, the iron sharpens iron is another one.
So one man sharpens another. That's from Proverbs, right? Yeah, I think so.
But in that sense, it doesn't necessarily say you need a church. So there's a very big. So when we're talking to this guy, he was also saying that there's a difference between having a church and having a Christian community in Primus, for example. So maybe you can talk about what's the difference, why we need a church. For example, if maybe someone in Primus, can we argue that person doesn't need to go to a church because he has this community in Primus, assuming Primus doesn't end now.
Okay, I guess we can break down the question a little bit. So the question would be, what does the church provide that a Christian needs?
So I think it's everyone can agree that a Christian needs a Christian community. Yes. Because there's a lot of verses that fellowship and iron sharpens iron. It's just that, can this Christian community be found outside church?
That's a very good question.
Yeah. So I mean, okay, so the church, I guess the standard church provides a place where you can share your testimonies, your sharings with the people that are around you, usually of the same age, I guess. And then apart from that, you have the sermon as well. So it would be spiritual. What's the word for it? Feeding. Yeah. So being fed lah. So being fed the word.
But can that not happen in a Christian community as well? For example, if you have a Primus community and maybe led by an officer, and the officer acts as a pastor.
Right. So say you have all the components of churches that is not church.
Yeah.
Would that suffice?
Can it fully replace church? Yeah.
Oh, by logic, I think yes. That's my logic. Because if there's no difference and the activities are the same and what you gain is the same, then what's the difference?
Right.
Is there a difference in the fact that a church is very, how do I say, its main purpose or is designated as a spiritual place versus something like Primus is not officially a spiritual place, i.e. it's very easy for it to go off tangent.
I think one of the things that church has that other outside things like Primus don't have is continuity. At least my church, right? You start, you can start number 3, then go up the ranks and ranks, and so it's kind of set you for life. Primus is 2-year thing.
I guess you would say it's the duration, right? So because
what
it's so
if
long term.
we take out the duration? So for example, if our community year in Primus, we continue beyond Primus, which happens to a lot of cohorts. Primus becomes their cell group, and then some people could argue I don't need to go to church anymore. I got this cell group here where I in fact gain even more. Then why do I need a church? Because even I have this spiritual family outside church already, so I don't need a church anymore. Some people can argue like that, and I feel like the difference is actually in just the labeling, because the church is labeled as a very religious thing, and so has a very, very clear purpose, and it's very single-minded, single goal. Versus this community outside, we can do a lot of other things and it's very easy to stray from the spiritual stuff. So for example, if we use the Primus example again, a Primus cell group could easily turn into a games group or just joke fest lah. Or even a gaming group, whereas a church is much harder for it to do so.
Yeah, actually, I think that's quite true. Because if Primus, is fully focused on just Christian stuff, then
will become a church.
Yeah, that's a church.
Right, but couldn't you just say the same as well for churches? Because primers has the tendency to stray off into something that's not as,
Yeah.
I guess, God-centered, right? But then you could say the same for cell group, for example. Like I've heard many cases of groups that met up and like they didn't talk about anything spiritual and they didn't pray at all, right? And so you could say just as well that well, church has the tendency to stray off from its original intent, right?
I think it was more like a long-term thing. Like in the long term, it's much easier for the primers group to stray. Whereas
Yeah.
for a church, everyone knows they're coming there for church.
Yeah.
Not like a primers.
Exactly.
We come to primers not necessarily for CD all the time. Come for like games or the juniors or everything, or to see each other and stuff. Not like church. You're coming there solely to for God. And I think that's a difference. Where and that's what I mean by the labeling makes a difference, because it's very clearly labeled that you are there for the word and for God. Whereas primers, you are there for many other things. God is just the first thing on the list. And that's the problem when churches do things other than when churches stray too far from the original intent of godliness and whatever nonsense, then they become not really a good church.
What do you mean by stray too far?
Secularized.
Yeah, for example, if a church secularizes too much, then it starts to focus a lot more on gaining people and gaining membership rather than trying to actually spiritually teach people. In that sense, they become something like
Like
primers.
Clubhouse.
Yeah, like a clubhouse, exactly, where its focus is just to recruit members with fun activities, and then you have this long list of activities that does not support your main goal. For example, okay, to go on further, in primers we have this long list of activities, right? It's just like the word of God is first, then there's drill, adventure, whatever. The word of God is always first. These other activities don't necessarily support that first goal. They're all activities by their own, and we try to incorporate spiritual things into each activity just because that's our top priority. But it is not I wouldn't say it's the main priority, because a church has that as the main priority. And so a church should have that as the main priority, and all the other activities a church do must support that main priority. Not like in primers, we don't teach drill in order to teach the word of God. It's a bit more separate. Whereas a church will have something like fellowship, so you can connect with, like, for example, like having dinner with your cell group. You have dinner with your cell group, so you can connect with them, so you can grow each other spiritually. And whereas a spiritual community outside like primers might have many different goals, a church has one goal, and everything other activity supports that one goal.
How about like CF?
So the question is CF a church?
They have
No.
they bring speakers on sometimes. They have worship. They have cell groups.
Okay, in this sense, I think you could loosely define it as a church. Not like in the official church registry, that kind of thing, but in
Like the
principle, it's
youth
basically
group of a church.
yeah, in principle, it's like the youth group of a church. Because again, their main goal and their sort of only goal is to fellowship with godly stuff and everything.
I think also there's a real danger for these things to, like the non-church things to become church. I think sometimes, like I've heard before that people say, like BB isn't a church or CF isn't a church. You're not supposed to treat it like a church. So I guess where do you guys think is the line that it crosses when people start to treat it as a church? Or
What do you mean by treat it as a church?
as in, because okay, so I would think that you cannot fully replace church with CF, correct? That makes sense, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's like say I'm a regular and avid CF member, right? But because of my overemphasis on CF, for example, I neglect my duties in church. I don't come for a cell group in church, for example, and then I place so much emphasis on CF. Not that it's a bad thing to put emphasis on CF, but it's more a bad thing to neglect the church that you are in. So I think there is a real tendency to stray away. No, not stray away. There's a tendency to
Replace church.
Yeah, replace church with these things.
But what if you're getting more spiritually from?
Yeah. Okay, wait. To address the BB thing, I think for BB it's very easy because BB is clearly not a church because we have so many other priorities, or not priorities, so many other goals like drill, adventure, first aid, everything. So in that sense, BB is not a church, and that's why BB should never be a church, because the goal of BB has many other things. So BB cannot replace your church, and the BB program must not become like a church, where the only thing is you come preach the word of God and go home. then you don't do anything else because that's not BB. For CF, it's a bit more complicated because that is the goal. That is CF. You come there, hear the word, and go home. That's no offense to CF, but that's all CF does. Yeah, in reality. So and you could, and just now we all agree that in principle CF is basically a church, just like a church. In terms
Yes.
of the
I
goal.
think so lah, because they also bring pastors. Or
Yeah, and so
pastors.
but then again, we cannot. It's a bit hard to say that CF can replace your church.
Well, you say that the defining factor is actually the duration that CF is in your life. So, like because CF is like a 2-year or 6-year or whatever, but it's still not a like a lifelong kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so therein lies the difference, lah. You shouldn't do that.
Oh, that makes sense. Because I was thinking, what if hypothetically CF is replaced by this other organization that's not officially a church, maybe started in school but has grown to become something people like always go back to. So like, I think we can also argue, we can think of two different cases. One case is like this guy is a new believer and then comes to know Christ through CF, so he doesn't have a church but only goes to CF. Can CF become his church then? Because that's where that's the only Christian place he knows. And second case, a guy who has his own church decides to go to CF, finds that CF is more useful than his own church, and so wants to make CF his church instead. And for both of these conditions, hypothetically, what if CF could last for your entire life? I.e., you keep coming back.
I think if that's the case, then CF, I would define CF as a church.
Yeah, you could define CF as a church, right?
But I think an important part that also distinguishes the two is that CF doesn't have your blood ties, your family, and I think that there's also great value in like going to the same place of worship and learning and all that with your own family. Because I mean, those at the end of the day, those are the people that you will know for like the longest, and you interact with them like every day. Yeah.
So what about? But there's also a lot of cases of people who parents go to a different church.
Yeah.
That's true.
I'd say that actually, I think from what I'm hearing, that I think the only real reason why a church is necessary is because it's stable, right? It's a stable place that once you're in there, I mean, apart from the fact that you can lose the faith and drop out, is that it's a thing that will carry you through your entire life, and so it's like that baseline. You can take on other electives like CF, ED, and whatnot, but the church is always there for you. It will always be there. So I think that's the value in church. Yeah. So I guess you would recommend, right, that whoever, if people don't have a church currently, that it's still better to have
Find a
church.
church.
Find a church. Yeah.
Okay.
So I hope you enjoyed that episode of The Extreme Exchange, number 5. Yeah, and I hope it was fruitful for you as well. So I'll see you in the next episode of Extreme Exchange. Bye-bye. Wait, you guys were all supposed to say bye-bye.
Oh,
You didn't tell us that.
Yeah,
So far, I didn't tell any of the other episodes, they all did it.